He changed the locks, said it so calmly I almost didn't understand at first. "It's my house now," he repeated, and for a moment I thought he was joking, that strange, nervous kind of humor men use when they don't want to say what they really mean. But then he held up the new set of keys like a trophy and dropped my old ones into my palm. The metal was warm, as if the keys themselves had just been replaced by something younger, shinier, more obedient. I stood there on the porch I'd paid for, in the rain that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to fall or hang in the air. I looked at my son, the same boy whose night terrors I used to soothe by singing softly, whose first steps had been from my arms to his father's, and I realized he was speaking to me as if I were an intruder. That's what hurt the most. Not the words, not even the loss, but the tone, polite, managerial, practiced. I am 81 years old. I sleep in my car now, in the library parking lot, where the Wi-Fi reaches just far enough to make me feel like I still exist in the world. I keep my medication in a little cooler, my nightgown folded under the driver's seat. It's not as terrible as you might think, not at first. The car smells faintly of lavender sachets I refuse to throw away. The radio still works. Sometimes I listen to the late-night programs where strangers talk about ghosts and regrets. I feel comfortable among both. I have a thermos of instant coffee, a stack of newspapers, and a blanket my neighbor gave me last Christmas before she moved to Florida. It's not comfort, but it's something like survival, a strange kind of steady heartbeat after the shock has passed. People imagine betrayal as something loud, screaming, slammed doors, tears staining carpets, but mine arrived quietly, the way dusk comes to a room you forgot had windows. I should have seen it coming, of course. The small signs were there like crumbs leading to an ending I refused to name. The conversations that grew shorter, the calls that went unanswered, the way David began talking about simplifying things, as if my life were an outdated subscription he needed to cancel. His wife, Melissa, always smiled too tightly when I entered a room, her voice dipped in sugar, but sharp underneath. "You know, Mom, it might be safer if you let David handle all the paperwork." And I, foolish creature of habit, let her. Because you want to believe your children know better, that the years you gave them turned into wisdom, not strategy. After my husband died, I sold the small house where we'd lived for 40 years and gave the money to David for the new one. He promised it would be our home, a place where I'd have a room with sunlight and a view of the garden. I remember the way he hugged me that day at the bank, the faint tremor in his hands as he signed the papers. "You'll never have to worry again," he said. How easily we accept comfort when it's offered in our children's voices. I thought I was buying peace, not a ticket out of my own life. It started with little things. A new security system installed without my input. My name quietly missing from the utility bills. A conversation about estate planning where every word was wrapped in the gauze of concern. He said, "You'll thank me later, Mom, when everything's streamlined." I thanked him then too, because gratitude was the only language I knew how to speak with my son. I didn't understand that every signature I gave him was a small surrender. Every document I didn't read a step closer to exile. The day he changed the locks, I'd gone to the pharmacy for my blood pressure medication. It took longer than usual. There was a delay with the insurance, and by the time I returned, the porch light had been replaced. The bulb was cooler, whiter, unfamiliar. It sounds ridiculous to notice something like that, but light tells you everything about a home. It either welcomes you or reminds you you're not expected. My key didn't fit. I tried it 3 times gently, like coaxing a sleeping child. Then I knocked, softly at first, then louder. I saw the curtain move, then his face. He opened the door halfway, like a salesman. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." I remember the way the air smelled, rain and fresh paint. There were cardboard boxes stacked by the wall, some labeled storage, and others with nothing at all. My things, my life, portioned into anonymous cubes. He didn't let me in. "Melissa and I have decided it's better if you take some time," he began, voice trembling just enough to sound compassionate. "It's not safe for you here alone when we're at work. You've fallen twice this year, remember? We found a wonderful assisted living community near the lake. Your name's already on the list." I stared at him, trying to recognize the man who used to cry when his goldfish died, the boy who once made me a paper crown for Mother's Day. "I live here, David," I said quietly. "This is my house." He shook his head slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "It's mine now, Mom. You signed it over last year, remember?" No, I didn't remember. I remembered trusting him. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table signing forms while Melissa refilled my tea. I remembered the softness of their voices, the way they smiled as if they were doing me a favor. But the specifics? No, my eyes aren't what they used to be, and my faith, it seems, was blinder than both. He handed me an envelope with printed documents, neat and official. "It's all legal," he said, as if legality and love were the same thing. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there with the rain dripping from my hair, my cardigan clinging to my arms, and I thought about how strange it is that a person can vanish from her own home without taking a single step. Behind him, the house was warm and humming, the television murmuring softly. The smell of dinner, roast chicken time, reached the porch. Ordinary domestic peace, except for me, locked outside of it. That night, I sat in my car at the end of the street, watching the lights go out one by one. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my son had been too efficient? That kindness can turn administrative? I drove aimlessly for hours until I found the library lot. The silence there felt neutral, not accusing. I parked under a flickering lamp and wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. I told myself it was only for one night, just until morning. But morning brought the sheriff. A soft knock on the window, polite, practiced. "Mrs. Lang?" he asked, holding a folder. "I'm afraid there's an eviction notice here. The property's been transferred." I remember nodding as if he were telling me the weather report. I took the papers from him, the seal embossed, my name printed beneath the words, "Former occupant." That phrase stung more than any insult. Former occupant, as though I were a ghost politely escorted off the premises. The sheriff was kind in the way officials often are when they meet human wreckage, gentle but distant, professional sympathy, like a plastic cup of water handed out after a marathon. He said, "If you need to retrieve belongings, you'll have to schedule it through Mr. Lang." Mr. Lang, my son. After he left, I sat in the car for a long time, reading the papers over and over, hoping that repetition could turn them back into something reversible. They smelled faintly of toner and lemon cleaner, as if someone had wiped away fingerprints before handing them over. I remembered how David used to draw castles with me at the kitchen table, how he always made sure the windows had curtains. Because homes should have privacy, Mom. Privacy, not secrecy. How quickly one becomes the other. By noon, the sun came out, sharp and indifferent. I drove to the park where the benches were still slick from rain. I watched mothers push strollers, teenagers scroll through their phones, joggers pass by with earbuds shutting out the world. No one looked at me twice. I was invisible in the way old women often are which in that moment felt like both curse and protection. I thought about my husband, how he used to say, "People show you who they are when you stop being useful." At the time, I thought it was cynicism. Now it felt like prophecy. As the day stretched and the light softened, I realized I wasn't crying. There was no room for tears, only the heavy, practical awareness that life as I'd known it had ended without ceremony. I thought of the house, the garden I'd planted, the lilac bush just beginning to bloom, and wondered if Melissa would cut it down. Probably. Lilac smells like memory, and memory doesn't suit people who prefer a clean start. I reclined the seat of my car and closed my eyes. The hum of passing traffic sounded like distant surf. Somewhere a child laughed. I pressed my fingers against the old key, the one that no longer opened anything, and felt the edge bite into my palm. Pain is proof, I thought. Proof that I'm still here, that the story isn't over, that what's been taken can still be reclaimed, if not in wood and stone, then in truth. The sun slid behind a cloud. The world kept moving, and I, for the first time in a very long time, had nowhere to go and no one to answer to but myself. I went back the next morning because I still couldn't believe it. I had spent the night in the car, wrapped in my old cardigan, telling myself that there had to be some misunderstanding, that David would come to his senses once the anger or the panic, whatever it was, had passed. The dawn was pale and bitterly cold, the kind that makes everything look stripped and unsentimental. The street was quiet when I turned the corner, and for a moment I felt like a trespasser in a life that used to be mine. The house stood there exactly as before, but it had changed its expression, as though even the bricks had agreed to forget me. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox replaced with a sleek steel one that didn't have my name on it anymore, and the potted fern I'd kept by the door for 5 years was gone. It was as if the house itself had shed me overnight. I parked by the curb and sat still, watching the windows for any sign of movement. I imagined David coming out, seeing me, realizing how cruel it all had been, maybe even apologizing. I wanted to believe that some shred of the boy I raised still lived behind that polished exterior, that he would remember the countless times I'd waited on those same steps for him to come home safe. I finally stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, holding the eviction papers as if they were some kind of charm that could reverse what had been done. I rang the bell. Nothing. I rang again, and I heard a child's voice inside, Melissa's youngest from her first marriage, calling for her. Then footsteps, the quick shuffling of hesitation, and the latch turning just enough for her face to appear in the narrow gap. "Oh," she said, her voice flat. "You came back." "I live here," I answered quietly, though even as I said it, the words sounded wrong in the air, fragile and outdated, like a foreign phrase no one uses anymore. Melissa sighed, the way people do when confronted with a tedious chore. She didn't open the door any wider. "David's not home," she said. "He's at work." "I need to speak with him," I said. "There's been some mistake." "There's no mistake." Her tone hardened, still polite but final. "You signed everything over, remember? The lawyer explained it all last year. It's in his name now. You really shouldn't make this harder for everyone." "I never signed away my home," I said. "He said it was just for taxes, for convenience." "Then you should have read before you signed," she replied, a hint of triumph in her voice. "You always trusted too much. David only did what was necessary." She might as well have said he had euthanized a dog. Necessary. The word cut deeper than any accusation could. I stood there on the porch holding the useless papers, watching as she glanced over her shoulder, nervous that the neighbors might see. "I just need to get a few of my things," I said. "My photographs, my coat, the jewelry your husband's father gave me. They're in the garage, she said quickly, almost rehearsed. David boxed everything. I'll ask him to bring it to you later. Then, like a sudden gust of irritation, she added, You shouldn't be here without permission. If someone calls the police, it won't look good for either of us. And then the door closed, not slammed, not even locked immediately, just gently shut, as though she were sealing off an unpleasant smell. I stood there for a while longer, my reflection faint in the glass of the door. Inside, I could hear the faint murmur of a television, the rhythmic thump of a washing machine, normal life continuing behind my back. Finally, I walked around to the side gate and looked into the backyard. The garden was trimmed to sterile precision, the lilac bush already uprooted, its spot marked by a perfect square of soil. My clothesline was gone. The wind chimes I'd hung from the porch beam were missing too. I wanted to be angry, but what I felt was closer to mourning. Not grief for the loss of property, but for the erasure of evidence that I had ever lived there at all. When I turned back toward the driveway, I saw the garbage bins lined up neatly by the curb. 3 black bags leaned against one of them, and I knew before I touched them that they were mine. I opened one. Inside were framed photographs wrapped in old towels, a stack of books, my winter scarf, and the porcelain teapot that had belonged to my mother. The handle was cracked. The second bag held clothes, folded roughly, still faintly smelling of cedar from my closet. The third was filled with papers, old bills, recipe cards, letters from my sister in Arizona. I remember staring at those bags, thinking how absurdly light a life becomes when reduced to what fits in plastic. I loaded them into the trunk of the car, one by one, careful not to tear them, though part of me wanted to rip them open just to scatter everything onto the driveway. When I got back into the car, I saw David's vehicle turning the corner. My heart kicked once, a sudden desperate hope that he'd stop, that he'd see me there and understand. He parked in the driveway, but didn't get out right away. He saw me. I know he saw me. We stared at each other through the windshields like two strangers caught at a red light. Finally, he stepped out, straightened his tie, and walked toward me. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, "you shouldn't be here." "This is my home," I said. "It was," he replied. "It isn't anymore." He looked tired, or maybe just inconvenienced. "You can't keep doing this. The neighbors are talking. I'm trying to handle this the right way. I've made arrangements for you at Silver Pines. It's a good place. Clean, safe, professional staff. You'll have company, activities. You'll like it there." I laughed then, quietly, because the words were so rehearsed they almost sounded like a sales pitch. "You want to put me away," I said. "You want me somewhere where you can visit once a month and call it duty." He rubbed his forehead. "I'm trying to protect you. You're not well. You get confused. You forgot things, papers, bills, your medications." I looked at him steadily. "I forgot nothing except to stop trusting you." His jaw clenched. "If you make this ugly, Mom, I'll have to do what's necessary. There are laws about competency, about safety. Don't push this." That was the moment the last thread snapped, the realization that he wasn't bluffing. He would rather erase me than face me. He stepped back, already done with the conversation, and went inside without another word. The door closed behind him, and the lock clicked. I sat there until the light began to fade again, reading the eviction papers line by line. My signature was there, shaky, but undeniably mine, witnessed and notarized. I tried to remember the day I signed them. It must have been at the kitchen table, perhaps when Melissa served me chamomile tea, the scent of lemon, her smile bright as glass. She had probably said something like, "Just routine paperwork, Mom," and I had nodded, eager to be helpful, to feel included. I realized then that my downfall wasn't trust. It was loneliness disguised as cooperation. The next few days blurred together. I drove aimlessly between motels and rest stops, sleeping for a few hours at a time, trying to gather the courage to do something, though I didn't yet know what. At night, I would replay every moment, every small favor I had done for David, every time I had said yes when I wanted to say no. The memories felt like sharp stones in my throat. I thought about calling my niece, but shame kept me silent. How do you tell someone that your own child has outsmarted you? How do you explain that love can turn into paperwork and that signatures can become a kind of execution? On the fourth morning, I went to the county records office. The building was sterile, humming with fluorescent lights, full of people pretending not to see one another. I told the woman at the desk I needed a copy of the deed for 118 Maplewood Lane. She typed, frowned, printed a sheet. "It's in David Lang's name," she said. "Transferred 12 months ago under a gift of property declaration. Everything looks legitimate." She was kind, but detached. "If you believe there was fraud, you'll need to file a report. Elder Abuse Division's on the second floor." The words elder abuse made my stomach twist. I wasn't a victim, I wanted to say. I was just foolish. But I took the elevator to the second floor anyway. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and nervous breath. A young woman in a blazer handed me a form. "Describe what happened," she said. "Dates, witnesses, any proof." Proof. I thought of my shaking hands signing those papers, of Melissa refilling my teacup. That was all the proof I had, memory and regret. I filled out what I could, my handwriting slanted and uneven. When I handed it back, she looked at me gently, the way people look at something delicate that might break in their hands. "We'll be in touch," she said. Outside, the sun felt too bright, the air too clean. I walked slowly to my car, each step heavy but deliberate. I had always believed that family was the last safe place, the one circle that couldn't be broken. But now I understood that safety built on silence isn't safety at all. The papers in my hand weren't just evidence. They were the beginning of something. I didn't know yet what it would cost me, but I knew I wasn't going to disappear quietly. The betrayal was complete, yes, but so was the clarity. When I sat behind the wheel, I looked at the house one last time in my mind. The perfect lines of the hedge, the new mailbox, the fresh paint. I realized it wasn't my home anymore, not because of the deed, but because love cannot survive where ownership replaces affection. I turned the key, the engine shuddered awake, and for the first time since he changed those locks, I felt the faint, steady hum of resolve. I didn't know where I was driving, only that I would not stop until I reached the place where his voice no longer echoed in my head. The days that followed slipped through me like water through a sieve, each one cold, slippery, impossible to hold. I would wake in the car before dawn, the windows fogged, the seatbelt pressing against my ribs, my breath shallow from the chill that came with every October night. The library parking lot became a kind of station between nowhere and nothing, a place where people arrived in daylight to borrow stories and left before dark, never noticing the woman parked near the far lamp. I'd wash my face in the restroom sink, brush my hair, smooth my blouse, and look in the mirror at a stranger who had my eyes but not my certainty. It is astonishing how quickly you can learn invisibility, how naturally you fold yourself into the corners of public spaces so that no one feels obliged to see you. During the day, I sat by the window of the car, reading old newspaper clippings, trying to stay warm by keeping my mind busy. At night, I wrote down everything that had happened, the words, the signatures, the moments of silence between them, as if committing them to paper could make them less surreal. By the third day, I realized how tired my body was, not just from the lack of sleep, but from the quiet humiliation of being without a door to close behind me. I went to a small diner on the edge of town, ordered coffee, and sat as long as they'd let me, tracing the steam with my eyes. The waitress, a woman with tired kindness, refilled my cup without asking. She didn't pry, but she looked at me the way women do when they recognize the shape of a fall, even if they don't know its story. I left her a tip I couldn't afford. I told myself it was an act of faith, proof that I still had something to give. Everywhere I went, I carried the folder from the county office. It became my talisman, a paper spine that kept me upright. The woman in the elder abuse division had told me to wait, that the investigation could take weeks. I didn't have weeks. My car was running out of gas, my checking account down to its last $84. There was an ache in my hip that warned me the cold was winning. I thought about the assisted living facility David mentioned, the one by the lake, Silver Pines. I imagined the quiet corridors, the smell of bleach and soup, the sound of televisions murmuring in half-lit rooms. Maybe there was safety there, but it would not be mine. I wanted to live among people who spoke to me as if I were still here, not as if I had already begun to fade. On the fifth morning, I decided to drive past the house again. I told myself it was to remind me what I was fighting for, but in truth, I wanted to see if he missed me. The street looked the same. Manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, the faint hum of sprinklers, even though it was too cold for them. My house, no, his house, looked perfect. A moving truck was parked outside, 2 men carrying in boxes. I rolled the window down and heard them laugh. The sound was sharp, ordinary, cruel in its casualness. I watched as Melissa came out to direct them. She was wearing my wool coat, the blue one with the worn collar. For a second, I thought she'd borrowed it by mistake, but then I saw how it fit her, too perfectly, too deliberately. She turned her face toward the sun and smiled, the kind of smile people give to photographers, and I knew then that she wasn't pretending anymore. I started the car and drove away before she could see me. That night, I parked behind the old grocery store. The streetlights there were broken, and the shadows were kind enough to give me privacy. I kept the windows cracked, letting in the smell of damp asphalt and distant frying oil from the diner across the road. I made a list in my notebook, everything I needed to do to prove the fraud: contact the notary, request the original copies, find witnesses who remembered the day of the signing. I realized I would have to find a lawyer, though I had no money to pay one. I thought of the church bulletin board, where they sometimes posted free legal clinics, and decided to start there. I told myself this was not about revenge, but about truth. Yet beneath that noble idea was something quieter, more dangerous. I wanted him to know he hadn't won. The following morning, I drove to the church where I used to volunteer. It felt smaller than I remembered, as if the years had stripped it of grandeur. The secretary at the desk didn't recognize me at first. Her hair was shorter now, her glasses thicker. "Mary?" she asked after a moment. "I thought you moved in with your son." I forced a smile. "I did," I said, "but life has a way of moving you back out again." She hesitated before handing me a flyer. "There's a legal aid group that meets on Thursdays. They help with property issues sometimes. It's mostly for low-income cases, but you can try." I thanked her and sat for a moment in the pews, feeling the strange comfort of emptiness around me. The air smelled faintly of candles and dust. I remembered sitting there years ago with David at Christmas, his small hand gripping mine while the choir sang. I wondered if he ever remembered it, or if memory itself was something he'd learned to outgrow. At the legal aid meeting, there were 5 of us, a young man fighting eviction, a middle-aged woman whose husband had emptied their joint account, an old farmer with a dispute over land, and me. The volunteer lawyer, a thin woman named Carla, with kind but hurried eyes, listened patiently as I explained what happened. She asked questions, took notes, and finally said, "If the signature's real, it's going to be difficult, but not impossible. We can request the notary's log. Sometimes they cut corners." She looked up at me. "Do you remember who notarized it?" I shook my head, ashamed. "I think her name was Fowler. She came to the house." Carla nodded. "Then she should be in the records. We'll check." Her voice was steady, practical, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of solid ground beneath me. When I left, the afternoon light had turned golden, the air crisp with the scent of burning leaves. I walked to the car slowly, feeling the ache in my joints, but also a strange calm. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had a name, a process, a small beginning. That night, I drove to a nearby motel that charged by the week and used my last savings for a room. The clerk, a young man with bored eyes, handed me the key without looking up. Room 6 smelled of detergent and loneliness, but it had a bed and a lamp. I took a long shower, let the water run until the mirror fogged, and then sat on the edge of the bed with a towel around my shoulders. I cried then, not from grief, but from the exhaustion of having held myself together for so long. The tears came quietly, like relief, like the body finally remembering it was allowed to feel. In the morning, I called the notary office listed on one of the papers David had given me months ago. A woman answered, her voice smooth and guarded. "This is Fowler Notary Services." I introduced myself and asked if she remembered the day she'd come to my son's house. There was a pause. "We don't usually discuss client details," she said. I pressed gently. "It's important. The transfer involved my home. I believe there was a mistake." Another pause. Then quietly she said, "I do remember that appointment. The wife scheduled it. You seemed tired. I asked if you were sure about signing, and she said it was just to simplify the title. You nodded." I swallowed hard. "Did I sign voluntarily?" I asked. Her voice softened. "You signed, ma'am, but it didn't feel like a gift." That sentence clung to me long after the call ended. The legal aid office filed a preliminary complaint. I didn't know what it meant yet, only that something official now existed in the world on my behalf. Still, the waiting was unbearable. Every day I expected a call that never came, a letter that didn't arrive. In that suspended time, my thoughts turned inward, and I began to question everything I'd been taught about family. We are told that motherhood is a guarantee, that love flows downward like gravity and comes back as gratitude. But it isn't a law of nature, only a fragile hope. I began to realize that what I had taken for devotion was dependency dressed in gentleness, that my life had been an unending rehearsal for generosity without audience or applause. One evening, as I sat outside the motel room, watching the sky bruise into twilight, I saw an elderly couple walking hand in hand down the street. The woman's laugh carried on the wind, bright and whole. It startled me. How foreign joy sounded when it wasn't forced. I thought of Derek, my husband, gone these 12 years, and wondered what he would have said. Probably nothing. He was a quiet man. But he would have looked at me the way he used to when something broke in the house, and he didn't know how to fix it. Half pity, half determination. And I realized then that I had been waiting for someone to rescue me again, and there was no one left to do it. The only rescue possible was the kind that begins in silence, in the decision to stop waiting. The first escalation wasn't the change of locks or the eviction notice. It was the slow shift inside me from disbelief to defiance. It happened quietly, without announcement, like the moment a storm stops being threatening and becomes cleansing. I was no longer trying to return to the life I had lost. I was learning to stand outside of it and look back without trembling. I began to keep a folder with every receipt, every note, every scrap of evidence. I called the clerk every other day, asked questions, wrote down her answers. I was polite, but I was relentless. And for the first time since he'd said, "It's my house now," I felt that I had a house of my own again, not made of walls and roofs, but of purpose, paper, and memory. That night, I turned off the lamp and lay in bed listening to the cars passing by the highway, their headlights flashing briefly against the ceiling. Each one sounded like a heartbeat too far away to touch. I thought of David, perhaps sitting in that house watching television, thinking the problem was over. I almost pitied him, because he didn't understand that you can't evict a person from her own soul, and that sometimes losing everything is just another way of being handed back your freedom. The first time I felt air that didn't taste like fear was the morning I went to the county clerk's office for the follow-up on my complaint. The waiting area smelled of paper and old carpet, the kind of bureaucratic scent that makes people nervous even when they've done nothing wrong. I had dressed carefully that day, in my best wool skirt and the navy sweater I used to wear to church, because I wanted to look like someone who still believed she mattered. Behind the counter was a woman named Renee who recognized me from the first visit. She had a kind face, the kind that seems to understand long before you speak. When she told me that the notary's file had been flagged for irregularities, something inside me straightened. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall that had kept me out of my own life. Renee explained that the notary had admitted under questioning that she had not verified my identity properly, that the documents had been prepared by my daughter-in-law before her arrival. "It doesn't prove fraud by itself," she said gently, "but it gives us grounds to challenge the transfer." I thanked her, though the words felt too small. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of rain and car exhaust, but I breathed it in deeply, as if I were tasting freedom for the first time. I walked to a small cafe across the street, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window. The glass was streaked with drizzle, the kind that makes everything outside look softened, half-dreamt. I took the folder from my bag and went through each page slowly, tracing my name as though reminding myself that it still belonged to me. It was strange how something as dry as legal proof could carry such tenderness. I realized I wasn't just fighting for property anymore. I was fighting for the right to be the author of my own story, not a footnote in my son's version of it. The waitress came by and asked if I wanted a refill, and when I nodded, she smiled and said, "You've got the look of a woman making decisions." It startled me, that word, decisions. For so long I'd thought of myself as someone to whom things happened, not someone who made them happen. That afternoon, I drove to the small legal aid office to meet Carla again. She looked tired, her desk a nest of folders and half-drunk coffee cups, but when she saw the new paperwork, she gave a little whistle. "This could change things," she said. She explained that if we could demonstrate undue influence, that my son and his wife had manipulated me when I was vulnerable, the court could nullify the transfer. "It won't be fast," she warned. "It'll take patience." I smiled at that. "Patience," I said. "That's one thing age doesn't take from you. Only the young are in a hurry." For the first time she laughed, and I realized how much I'd missed laughter that wasn't followed by apology. Over the next few weeks, my life found a rhythm again, though not the one I'd known before. Each morning I rose early, brewed instant coffee on the little hot plate I'd bought for the motel room, and spread my papers across the table like a map. The loneliness of those days was sharp, but it had edges I could live with. I made friends with the housekeeper, a thin woman named Rosa, who hummed to herself as she worked. When she learned that I was waiting on a legal case, she told me her own story of a brother who had taken her inheritance in Guatemala. "Family is the hardest thief to prove," she said. We shared that sentence like a piece of bread. Sometimes she would knock on my door after her shift and leave small gifts, an apple, a piece of chocolate, once even a paperback novel about women who reinvented themselves late in life. It wasn't the company of kin, but it was kindness, and I had learned to value that more. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the elder abuse investigator. The envelope was thick, official. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a summary of their preliminary findings, inconsistencies in the transfer documents, conflicting statements from the witnesses, and evidence that my signatures had been witnessed when I was alone with Melissa, not in the presence of an independent party. They recommended escalation to the district attorney's office. It meant nothing was over yet, but the tide had shifted. I sat there on the edge of the bed, the letter in my lap, and felt something close to awe. After months of being treated like someone fading from relevance, I was suddenly visible again, to the system, to the record, to myself. That evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood behind the motel. The air was cooling fast, the trees thinning into winter skeletons. Children rode bicycles down cracked sidewalks, their laughter carrying on the wind. I passed a small thrift store with a handwritten sign that read, "Everything has a second chance." I went inside, drawn by the phrase. The shopkeeper, an older man with a gentle voice, was arranging a row of coats. One of them caught my eye, a long gray wool coat, heavy and warm, with a belt tied neatly at the waist. It looked like something a woman might wear when she wanted to feel both protected and brave. I tried it on. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me. When I asked the price, he said, $10, but for you, $5. I paid full. On my way out, he said, "You look like you're going somewhere important." I smiled. "I think I finally am." Back in the room, I hung the coat by the door and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol of re-entry, of walking back into a world that had tried to push me out. I made a note in my journal that night. The opposite of loss isn't possession, it's presence. I fell asleep easily for the first time in months. The next morning, I received a call from the district attorney's office asking if I could come in for a statement. The woman on the phone was brisk, professional. I wrote down the address on the back of an envelope and drove there that afternoon. The waiting room was cold, full of people clutching papers like life rafts. When my name was called, I followed the assistant through a maze of corridors until we reached a small office. The investigator, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, offered me a seat. He asked questions for nearly an hour, dates, names, conversations. I answered carefully, my voice steady. When he asked what I wanted from all this, I said, "I want my name back." He nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant. Before I left, he said quietly, "You'd be surprised how many stories start just like yours, but not everyone fights." As I walked out, I realized that was the midpoint, the shift I hadn't noticed happening until it was complete. I was no longer the woman who waited on porches for apologies or slept in cars hoping for rescue. I had become someone who wrote letters to officials, who asked for files, who demanded to be recorded accurately. There was a power in that. A dignity I hadn't known was still mine. That night, I treated myself to dinner at the diner that had once been my refuge. The waitress recognized me and said, "You look different. You win the lottery or something?" I laughed and told her, "Something like that." I ate slowly, savoring every bite, not because the food was good, but because I felt worthy of the simple act of being served. Outside, the neon sign flickered in the window, turning the puddles pink and blue. It reminded me of how life insists on color, even after long stretches of gray. When I returned to the motel, there was a voicemail from David. His voice was calm, almost affectionate, but underneath it I could hear the strain. "Mom," he said, "I heard from the county. This is getting serious. You're making things worse for yourself. We could still solve this quietly if you'd just stop." I replayed it twice, each time noticing the way his tone shifted from concern to command. I didn't call back. Instead, I saved the message. Evidence. The next morning, I walked to the park nearby, wrapped in my new coat. The air was clear, the sunlight cold and pale, the kind that makes everything look precise. I sat on a bench and watched geese move across the water. They seemed so certain of where they were going, even when the wind pushed against them. For years, I had believed that aging meant shrinking, that survival meant surrender, but I saw now that it could also mean distillation, the stripping away of everything false until only the essential remains. I stayed in the park until my fingers went numb. When I finally rose to leave, I noticed a woman about my age feeding the birds. She smiled and offered me a handful of bread. "They only come close when you don't chase them," she said. I nodded, recognizing the truth in her small parable. On the walk back, I felt light, almost buoyant. There were battles ahead still, hearings, papers, confrontations, but something in me had shifted permanently. I no longer felt like a refugee from my own life. I was, in the quietest and most deliberate sense, returning home. When the letter arrived announcing the preliminary hearing, I felt a tremor that wasn't quite fear and not quite relief, but some hybrid emotion that lives only in people who have already lost everything once and know that survival, like love, never comes without a price. The hearing was scheduled for late January. The paper looked harmless enough, a simple sheet printed with my name, David's, and a case number, but holding it in my hands made my pulse quicken. It meant there would finally be a room, a table, a judge, a place where truth would have to be spoken aloud, not hidden in polite phone calls or the quiet cruelty of signatures made under the guise of filial devotion. For the rest of that day, I moved as if my body were slightly out of sync with time, like I had stepped into a slower current while the rest of the world kept rushing past. I spent the weeks before the hearing in a kind of suspended animation. Carla, the lawyer, came by the motel one evening carrying a stack of documents and that brisk tenderness that people in her profession develop after too many cases like mine. She explained what would happen: affidavits, cross-examination, the possibility of settlement. I listened, nodding, pretending to understand, though what I really heard was the echo of David's voice, the low, confident tone of a man who believed paperwork could justify betrayal. Carla noticed my silence and said gently, You'll have to see him there, you know. I said I was ready, though that wasn't true. How do you prepare to face the child who calls you mom in one breath and respondent in another? The night before the hearing, sleep abandoned me. I lay awake watching the shadows from the parking lot stretch and shrink across the ceiling. Every sound seemed amplified, the click of the heater, the hum of a distant car, the rustle of wind against the window. I thought about the first time I'd held David in my arms, how small and fierce he had felt, like something both fragile and destined. I remembered whispering promises to protect him, to love him no matter what, never imagining that the no matter what might one day mean protecting myself from him. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally dragged me into a shallow sleep, filled with dreams of doors opening and closing without anyone on the other side. The courthouse was colder than I expected, the kind of institutional chill that seems designed to remind everyone that emotion has no place there. Carla met me by the entrance, her hair pulled back, her briefcase heavy with the weight of my story. When we entered the courtroom, David was already there, sitting beside Melissa. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, his eyes dull with the particular fatigue that comes from guilt denied too long. Melissa wore a pale blue suit, immaculate, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. For a fleeting second, I felt sorry for her, because I could see in her the same thing that had trapped me for years, the belief that control can protect you from decay. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and I felt the strange solemnity of ritual, like a ceremony meant to test faith. The proceedings began with Carla presenting our case, her voice clear and firm. She spoke of coercion, of undue influence, of the irregularities in the notarization process. She showed photographs of my signature, the differences in pressure, the tremor that betrayed how little I had understood what I was signing. David's lawyer, a smooth man with a rehearsed calm, countered that I had gifted the property freely, that I had even told neighbors I was grateful to live with my son. He presented bank statements showing payments I had made for utilities after the transfer, as if gratitude could be translated into legal consent. When it was my turn to testify, I stood carefully, feeling the creak of my knees, the pulse of blood in my hands. The judge asked me to tell my story, and for the first time since all this began, I did so without trembling. I described the afternoon at the kitchen table, the smell of lemon tea, the way Melissa hovered with papers already laid out, the warmth of David's hand on my shoulder as he said, "It's just to make things easier." I told them how I had trusted, not out of ignorance, but out of love, because mothers are taught to trust their sons the way sailors trust the sea. It may drown you, but you still believe in it. I told them about the night I came home to find the locks changed, about the sheriff's knock, about sleeping in my car, wrapped in the blanket that used to cover David's bed. When I finished, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The judge nodded once, gravely, as if he had seen too many stories like mine to be surprised, but not enough to be indifferent. Then David was called. He avoided my eyes as he took the stand. His lawyer guided him gently through the script. He was concerned for my health, worried about my confusion, wanted to secure my future. Every sentence sounded polished, sterile. But when Carla asked him why he had transferred the utilities to his name before the alleged gift, his confidence faltered. He stammered something about efficiency, about how it just made sense. Carla pressed further, asking about the notary's visit, about why Melissa had prepared the documents without me present. His answers grew shorter, the mask beginning to slip. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, almost pleadingly, "Mom, you don't remember how bad things were. You were losing track of bills. You left the stove on twice. I was trying to help you." That was the moment something inside me hardened. "And locking me out was help?" I said before I could stop myself. The judge rapped his gavel lightly, a warning, but I didn't need to speak again. The truth had already stepped out of my mouth and into the air, undeniable. Afterward, while the lawyers exchanged closing remarks, I watched David's hands fidget in his lap. Those same hands had once held mine when crossing the street, small and trusting. I wondered when they had learned to sign lies so neatly. When the hearing ended, the judge said he would review the evidence and deliver a decision within 30 days. 30 days, an eternity measured in waiting rooms and sleepless nights. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a low gray, heavy with unshed snow. Carla touched my arm and said, "You did well." I nodded, though I didn't feel victorious. I felt emptied, scraped clean. As she walked away, I saw David and Melissa leaving through the opposite door. He looked at me briefly, something flickering in his expression. Maybe shame, maybe anger, maybe the last glimmer of the boy he once was. Melissa kept her eyes straight ahead. I watched them cross the parking lot together, two figures retreating into a life built on silence. The following weeks stretched out in uneasy quiet. I tried to fill the hours with routine, writing in my journal, walking to the park, calling the clerk's office for updates. But beneath every task was the hum of anxiety, the knowledge that at any moment a letter could arrive and decide my fate. One evening, as I was returning from the grocery store, I saw a car parked outside the motel. David was sitting inside, the engine idling. My heart lurched. I approached slowly, and when he rolled down the window, the heat from the car fogged the cold air between us. "You shouldn't be here," I said. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I just wanted to talk," he said. "No lawyers, no papers, just us." I hesitated, then nodded. He gestured to the passenger seat, and I got in. The car smelled of leather and the faint cologne he'd worn since college. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Mother and son sitting in a car, trying to find their way back to a conversation they'd lost. Then he said, "You can still stop this. The court doesn't have to get involved any further. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're comfortable. You can even move back in if you want. We'll just forget the legal part." I turned to him slowly. "You mean I can live in the house I paid for as your guest?" He sighed. "You make it sound ugly. It doesn't have to be like that. I'm offering you peace." "Peace built on theft isn't peace," I said. His face tightened. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I wanted it to go this far? You're making me out to be some kind of monster." I studied him for a long time. "I don't need to make you out to be anything, David. You did that yourself." He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "If you keep pushing this, you'll lose everything. The house, the money, me." "I already lost you," I said quietly, opening the door. "The rest is just paperwork." He didn't try to stop me. I walked back to my room without looking back. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind, not as threats, but as confirmation. The boy I'd raised had been replaced by a man who thought ownership could replace love. I realized then that the fight wasn't just about a house. It was about refusing to disappear into his version of me, the compliant old woman who said thank you for her own erasure. 2 weeks later, I received an envelope from the court scheduling a final hearing. The notation at the bottom read, "Subject to review of fraud determination." Carla called and said the DA's office had found additional evidence. The notary's logbook showing the appointment had been pre-signed before my arrival, something she called procedural misconduct. It strengthened our case significantly. For the first time, the possibility of victory felt real. But victory, I was learning, comes with its own kind of terror, the fear that after so much loss, you might not recognize what you've won. In the days leading up to the hearing, strange things began happening. The motel clerk told me someone had called, asking which room I was in. My mailbox was tampered with twice, the letters inside damp and torn. One night, I returned to find my car tires slashed. The police took a report, but shrugged. Without witnesses, there was little they could do. Carla urged me to stay with a friend, but I had no one close enough to ask. So I double-locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and slept with the light on. The fear didn't paralyze me this time. It sharpened me. I took photographs of everything, kept notes, saved receipts. If they wanted to make me afraid, I would answer with precision. The night before the final hearing, I sat at the small motel desk and wrote a letter. Not to David or the court, but to myself. I wrote that no matter the outcome, I had done what I came to do. I had refused silence. I ended it with a sentence that surprised me, even as I wrote it. Sometimes love has to burn down its own house to find the truth that survived inside the ashes. When I finished, I folded the letter and slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't know then that I would read it aloud in court the next day, but maybe some part of me already knew it was waiting for its moment. When the morning came, I felt calm, almost detached. The courtroom was smaller this time, the light softer. David sat 2 rows ahead, his posture rigid. I didn't look at him. The judge reviewed the new evidence, questioned the notary herself, who admitted that Melissa had arranged everything and had spoken for me during the signing. The words hung in the air like smoke. Carla handed the judge my letter, which I had shown her earlier, and asked permission for me to read a portion of it. The judge agreed. My voice didn't tremble as I read the final lines. When I finished, the silence in the room was different from the first time, deeper, fuller, the kind of silence that follows a truth that can't be argued with. The judge took a long breath before speaking. "Mrs. Lang," he said, "I believe you." Then he turned to David. "This transfer is hereby nullified." In that instant, I felt no triumph, only stillness. It was as though the air itself exhaled. David said nothing. He just lowered his head, a man unmasked not by accusation, but by the weight of his own choices. As I left the courtroom, the winter light spilling through the windows, I understood that this was not the end of the story, but the sharp, necessary point where loss stopped being something that happened to me and became something I had survived. When I returned to the house, it was late afternoon, and the winter sun was already draining out of the sky, leaving behind that washed-out color that looks like surrender. The court had ruled in my favor that morning, and the words of the judge, "The property shall revert to the rightful owner, Mrs. Lang," were still echoing in my ears, though they felt less like triumph and more like something sacred and fragile, like a promise whispered after too many years of silence. Carla had hugged me at the courthouse steps, her thin arms trembling with relief, and said she would handle the paperwork. "Go home," she told me. "You've earned it." Home. The word felt both heavy and light, like a language I hadn't spoken in a long time. I drove slowly down Maplewood Lane, the familiar rhythm of the tires on asphalt, stirring memories I had tried to bury. The street looked almost identical to the day I left. Pruned hedges, wind chimes, the smell of someone's fireplace drifting through the air. But I was not the same woman who had stood on that porch holding useless keys. I parked across from the house and sat in the car for a long time, watching the windows. The curtains were drawn, but a faint light pulsed behind them. I could see the shadow of movement inside. David, maybe Melissa, packing or pretending to. They had 30 days to vacate, the judge had said, though I had no desire to count them down like a jailer. I only wanted one thing, to cross that threshold again, not as a supplicant or a ghost, but as the woman who had finally claimed her own name. When I stepped out of the car, the cold air bit through my gloves, but I didn't flinch. I walked up the path slowly, noticing every small thing, the cracks in the walkway, the dead fern by the steps, the faint scent of the lavender I had planted years ago, still lingering under the frost. My hand hesitated on the doorknob before I remembered. These were my locks now. I turned the key. The door opened with a sound like an exhale. Inside, the air was still warm from the central heating, but it felt stale, unlived. The walls were bare where pictures used to hang, and the faint outlines of my old frames left ghosts of memory. The furniture was rearranged, the colors sterile and cold. There was no trace of the home I had built, only the polished impersonation of one. I walked through each room slowly, like a visitor in a museum curated by strangers. The kitchen smelled faintly of bleach and rosemary. My old teapot, the one with the cracked handle, was gone. In its place stood a sleek coffee machine, impersonal, expensive, silent. The refrigerator was nearly empty, except for a few containers, labeled in neat handwriting. I opened the cupboard and found one of my old mugs pushed to the back, chipped but still intact. I held it in both hands as though it were an artifact rescued from excavation. Upstairs, the bedrooms looked smaller than I remembered. In what used to be my room, the bed was stripped, the curtains drawn, the dresser empty. For a moment I imagined Melissa here, folding her clothes into my drawers, her perfume replacing mine, her careful hands erasing every trace of me. I didn't feel anger anymore, only an odd tenderness for her desperation. Perhaps she too believed she could build a sense of belonging from someone else's foundation. We all inherit our hungers. I moved down the hallway to David's old room. The walls still bore faint tape marks from the posters he'd once hung, baseball players, planets, his high school debate certificate. I opened the closet and found it almost empty, except for a single shoebox on the top shelf. Inside were fragments of the past, a photo of him as a child sitting on his father's shoulders, a report card, a postcard I had sent from a trip to the coast decades ago. On the back, I had written, "Always come home safe." I traced the faded ink with my finger, the words suddenly both promise and prophecy. For years, I thought home was something I gave to him. Now I saw it was something I had to give back to myself. I went downstairs again and opened the back door to the garden. The winter air rushed in, sharp and clean. The lilac bush was gone, its absence a wound in the soil, but there were small shoots of green beginning to emerge where its roots had once been, stubborn survivors of pruning and neglect. I knelt down, the ground cold beneath my knees, and pressed my hand into the dirt. "We're still here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to the garden or to myself. Behind me, I heard the front door open. The footsteps were cautious, slow. When I turned, David stood in the doorway, his shoulders hunched against the cold. His face looked thinner, the confidence gone. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, thick with all the words we had left unsaid. Finally, he said, "I wanted to come before you changed the locks." I nodded. "They're already changed." He winced slightly, but didn't move closer. "I wanted to explain," he said. "It got out of control. Melissa, She thought. "Stop," I said gently. "You don't have to explain. I understand more than you think." He looked at me with something like disbelief. "You're not angry?" "I was," I said, "for a long time. But anger's a fire that burns the wrong person. I don't need to keep it anymore." He stepped closer then, his voice lower. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" I asked quietly. "From being alive in my own life? From being inconvenient?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The wind outside rattled the windows. I saw the boy he used to be flicker in his eyes for a moment, before disappearing behind the man who had learned to confuse control with care. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "Good," I replied. "Then you won't be disappointed." He nodded once, almost gratefully, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "What are you going to do now?" I looked around the room, the walls, the floors, the faint scent of dust and time. "Live here," I said. "Really live. Not as someone's mother, not as someone's burden. Just me." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. He left quietly, closing the door behind him. I stood there listening to the sound of his car, fading down the street until it was gone. Then I locked the door, not out of fear, but out of finality. For the rest of the evening, I cleaned. I opened every window, letting the cold air chase out the stale. I scrubbed the counters, wiped the floors, gathered the few things that still belonged to me. With each small act, I felt the house begin to breathe again. The emptiness didn't frighten me. It felt like a blank page. When I finished, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea brewed in a new pot I had bought on the way home. The taste was slightly bitter, but it was mine. As darkness fell, I walked through the rooms once more, switching off the lights one by one. When I reached the porch, I stepped outside and stood beneath the bare branches of the oak tree. The sky was clear, and a thin crescent moon hung above the rooftops. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and a woman's laughter floated through the cold air. I thought about all the women I had met at the legal aid office, at the diner, in waiting rooms, each of them carrying her own invisible exile, each of them learning how to return to herself. We were all variations of the same story, rewritten in different hands. I went back inside and found myself standing before the mirror in the hallway. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her face was older, lined, her eyes shadowed but clear. There was a steadiness there I hadn't seen before, a quiet authority that comes only after losing everything that never truly belonged to you. I realized I no longer needed to prove anything, to the court, to David, to anyone. The proof was in the fact that I had endured. Before going to bed, I wrote one final note in my journal. "Today I reclaimed my house," I wrote, "but what I really reclaimed was the part of me that refused to die when they closed the door." The pen moved slowly, deliberately. There will always be people who think love gives them ownership, but real love, sets you free even when it costs everything. I set the pen down and exhaled, the sound small but complete. Upstairs, I opened the windows despite the cold. The air swept through the room, carrying the faint scent of the street, smoke, pine, a hint of rain. I lay down on the bare mattress, wrapped myself in the quilt I had retrieved from the garage earlier that day, and listened to the unfamiliar creaks of the house. Every home has its own heartbeat. I could feel this one slowing, adjusting, remembering me. The walls no longer felt like witnesses to humiliation. They were mine again, protectors of a quiet that I had earned. I fell asleep imagining the garden in spring, the lilac blooming again, the bees returning, the the sound of the wind chime I would hang where the old one had been. I dreamed not of revenge or apology, but of light filling the rooms, of laughter that didn't apologize for existing. When I woke at dawn, the sky was streaked with rose and gold. The house was cold, but it no longer felt empty. I made a pot of coffee, wrapped my new coat around me, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp enough to make my eyes water. Across the street, a neighbor waved. I waved back. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for permission to begin again. The locks had changed, the papers had been signed, the house was mine, and beneath all of it, quietly, faithfully, so was I. In the weeks that followed, the house began to remember me. It started with small things, the sort of quiet recognitions only a home can offer. The sound of the floorboard near the kitchen door that creaked in the same familiar rhythm when I stepped on it. The faint scent of cinnamon that returned when I baked something simple. The way the light fell across the hallway at 4 p.m. and made the walls glow like they used to when Derek was still alive and reading by the window. I filled the room slowly, not with furniture, but with air, with silence that wasn't empty, with the ordinary sounds of living that I had once taken for granted, the kettle whistling, the slow folding of laundry, the radio murmuring softly in another room. Every action felt ceremonial, an act of quiet possession. I didn't need to reclaim the house with declarations or keys. I reclaimed it with footsteps, with breath, with time. Carla came by one afternoon to check on me, her coat still dusted with snow. She brought a folder containing the final court documents, the official transfer, the reinstatement of my name, the restraining order against David. "It's all finished," she said, setting it gently on the table as if it were something fragile. I made tea for both of us, and as we sat by the window, she asked if I had any plans. "To stay," I said simply, "to stay and not vanish." She smiled at that, a kind of tired smile that came from recognizing a victory that wasn't about law, but about endurance. Before she left, she paused at the door and said, "You know, most people don't fight back. They just fade out quietly." I looked at her and said, "That's because no one tells them they're allowed to stay visible." When the door closed behind her, I stood for a long moment in the hush that followed, aware that this silence was not absence, but peace. The neighborhood had changed in subtle ways. A new family had moved into the house next door, a woman named Sarah, with 2 children who played basketball in the driveway until dusk. They were loud, careless, alive. The first time the ball rolled into my yard, Sarah came over, apologizing, but I only laughed and told her it was welcome to visit any time. She started bringing me small things, fresh bread, apples from the market, and we began to talk in the evenings on the porch, our breath turning to mist in the cold air. There was something effortless about her company, no questions, no pity. She told me once that her mother had died young and that she envied me for having lived long enough to reinvent myself. I told her that survival was not reinvention, but remembering what you were before the world told you to forget. At night, I would sit in the living room with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the snow fall through the window. Sometimes I thought of David, not in anger anymore, but with a strange clarity, as if he were someone from a story I had read long ago, whose ending had already been written. I knew he was still living in the next town. I saw his name once in the local paper, listed as a speaker for some real estate seminar. The old ache stirred but didn't wound. I no longer wished for apology or reconciliation. There is a kind of forgiveness that doesn't require conversation. It is simply the act of no longer letting the past borrow your voice. I learned that love, when it loses its shape, doesn't die. It just takes up less space inside you, enough that you can breathe again. I started volunteering at the library a few mornings each week. It felt right to be among books, those quiet witnesses of endurance. I helped the children's section first, organizing picture books, repairing torn pages, and the librarian, a kind woman named Jean, insisted that I read aloud to the kids on Thursdays. At first, I hesitated. My voice had grown unused to company, but when I began, the words came easily. The children sat cross-legged on the carpet, listening, their faces open and unguarded. I could feel something inside me knit together with every sentence. One little girl, with red mittens and a gap between her teeth, started waiting for me at the door each week. She said I reminded her of her grandmother. I smiled and told her, "Then your grandmother must be a very patient woman." It became our private joke. Spring came slowly that year, hesitant, as if the earth itself needed reassurance that it was safe to bloom again. The first thing I planted was lavender, in the same place where the old bush had been. The soil was stubborn, full of stones, but I worked it loose with my hands. When the shoots finally appeared, a tender green against the dark ground, I felt an almost maternal pride. I placed a small wooden bench near it and began spending my mornings there with my coffee, watching the street wake up. Neighbors waved as they passed. Once, a stranger stopped to tell me the garden smelled beautiful. I said thank you, but what I wanted to say was, this scent is proof that some roots survive no matter how many times you think they've been torn out. One evening, just before sunset, I sat at the kitchen table writing a letter. It was addressed to a woman I barely knew, an acquaintance from the legal aid clinic named Marjorie, who had been too afraid to file her own complaint against a son who had taken her savings. She had told me once, her voice shaking, that she didn't have the strength to start over at her age. I had promised to write her when it was all done. My letter was not a sermon or a list of instructions, just a story written in simple words. I told her how fear becomes smaller when you name it, how truth can be its own form of shelter, how there is life after humiliation, a whole landscape of quiet joys waiting for the day you stop waiting for permission to exist. I ended the letter with a single line. Nowhere is just a pause. You can begin again from there. After sealing it, I placed it by the door to mail in the morning. The light outside had turned golden, spilling across the floors like honey. I made tea, opened the back door, and stepped into the garden. The air was cool, but not cold. The lavender leaves shivered slightly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing, the rhythmic sound of a basketball bouncing, the faint whistle of a train. The world was carrying on, and so was I. Standing there, I thought of all the doors that had closed in my life, some by force, some by choice, and how each one, in its own cruel way, had led me here, to this small but steadfast moment of peace. I no longer measured time by loss, but by continuity. The days that began and ended with my own breath, unclaimed, ungoverned. There would be other winters, other trials, other shadows waiting at the edges of joy, but I knew now that none of them could unmake me. I was not the woman left on the porch or the one sleeping in her car. I was the woman who had walked back through the same door and built light where darkness had tried to take root. That night, before I went to bed, I stood in the hallway and looked once more at the framed photograph I had found in the shoebox, the one of David on his father's shoulders. I didn't cry. I simply touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "Be well. knowing it was the last time I would speak to that memory. Then I turned out the lights, the house settling around me with the soft, contented sigh of wood and wind. In the dark, I felt no fear. The house and I, both survivors of abandonment, were keeping each other company. Tomorrow would come, and I would greet it without dread. The locks were new, the air smelled of lavender and clean sheets, and when I closed my eyes, I dreamed not of what had been taken, but of what had finally been returned, the simple, immeasurable right to belong to myself.